My name is Stacy Robinson, and I was 28 years old when I finally accepted a truth I had spent most of my life trying to soften in my family. I was never meant to shine. I was meant to support the glow of someone else. I don't usually talk about my family publicly, especially not in a space like this. But the weight of everything that happened has been sitting in my chest for too long. I need to let it out, even if the truth is uncomfortable, even if it exposes wounds that never fully healed. From as far back as I can remember, I lived in the shadow of my younger stepsister, Chloe Robinson. She was 3 years younger than me, and from the moment she entered the family, the atmosphere shifted. I became the dependable one, the quiet presence who didn't demand attention, while Chloe became the center of gravity around which everything revolved. She was praised, protected, indulged. I was tolerated. That imbalance wasn't subtle and it wasn't imagined. It was baked into every interaction, every celebration, every silence. My biological mother passed away when I was 12. A year later, my father married Melissa Robinson, and with her came Chloe. At the time, I wanted to believe Melissa would be a fresh start, someone who might bridge the gap left by grief. Instead, she reinforced it. Melissa adored Chloe in a way that was almost performative, as if motherhood itself was something she had been waiting to enact correctly this time. I, on the other hand, felt like a reminder of a life she didn't choose. I wasn't mistreated openly. There were no dramatic punishments or obvious cruelty. But neglect has a way of being louder than anger. Chloe's birthdays were elaborate affairs. Themed decorations, extended family flying, and gifts, mussies that made my head spin. Mine were quieter. A cake from the grocery store, a quick smile, a reminder that we shouldn't make things too complicated. When I graduated high school with honors, my father patted my shoulder and said he was proud, before immediately shifting the conversation to Chloe's upcoming dance recital. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected. It taught me something important. Achievement meant very little if it didn't belong to the right person. I learned early not to compete. Instead, I focused inward. I studied harder, stayed later, and built a future that didn't rely on approval I knew I wouldn't receive. I graduated college with honors, found a stable job in finance, and bought my first home at 27. Independence wasn't just a goal for me, it was armor. Meanwhile, Chloe drifted. She dropped out of college after 2 semesters, claiming it wasn't for her, worked part-time at a coffee shop, and continued living at home rent-free. No pressure, no expectations. Our parents framed it as compassion, but I saw it for what it was: permission to remain suspended in comfort. Despite everything, there was one person who treated us equally: Grandpa Robert. He never favored, never compared, never minimized. He saw effort, not entitlement. When he passed away, the grief hit me hard, not just because I lost him, but because I knew the balance he represented would disappear with him. I didn't realize then just how much his absence would change everything. His death didn't just reopen old wounds. It set the stage for a reckoning none of us were prepared for. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish, the kind of place designed to make grief feel orderly, contained. We sat in a neat row, my father, Melissa, Chloe, a few aunts and uncles, and me, our expressions appropriately solemn, our hands folded like this was a ceremony rather than the dissection of a life. I told myself not to expect much. Grandpa Robert had always been fair, but fairness in my family had a way of being reframed once Melissa got involved. When the lawyer began reading the will, his voice calm and precise, the room stayed quiet. Grandpa had built his fortune himself: smart investments, discipline, patience. $4 million. The number landed like a physical force. I felt dizzy for a moment, not because of greed, but because of possibility. When the lawyer continued explaining that the estate would be divided equally among Grandpa's 3 children and his 5 grandchildren, I froze. Roughly $700,000 each. For me, for Chloe, for everyone. For a brief, fragile moment, I felt seen, validated, as if Grandpa had reached across the grave and said, "I noticed you. I know what you carried." I imagined paying off my student loans, finally starting the financial consulting firm I'd been sketching out in notebooks for years, building something that belonged to me entirely. It wasn't about luxury, it was about breathing room. That moment didn't last. Melissa's composure cracked almost immediately. Her jaw tightened, and she interrupted the lawyer mid-sentence, her voice sharp with disbelief. "That can't be right," she said, shaking her head as if the words themselves were offensive. The lawyer calmly repeated the terms, but Melissa leaned forward, eyes flashing. Chloe is still finding herself, she insisted. She needs that money. Some people here already have stability. I didn't miss the way her gaze slid toward me. After the reading, they cornered me in the hallway. My father cleared his throat, adopting the same tone he used when he wanted something but didn't want to admit it. Stacy, he began, your sister needs this more than you do. The words hit me harder than I expected, not because I was surprised, but because of how easily they were spoken. Melissa stepped in smoothly, her voice dripping with practiced concern. You're doing so well, sweetheart. A good job at house. You're set. She paused. Chloe is struggling. This could really help her get on her feet. I stared at them, stunned by the audacity. So, you want me to give her my inheritance? The question sounded unreal, even as I asked it. My father smiled faintly, as if this were a reasonable compromise. Not all of it. Maybe half. Just enough. I crossed my arms, my pulse pounding. No. Grandpa left that money to me. I'm not giving it away. Melissa's expression hardened instantly. So you're just going to let your sister struggle while you hoard all that money, she snapped. Something inside me finally cracked. She lives rent-free and works part-time by choice, I shot back. If she's struggling, it's because you've never let her stand on her own. That was the moment the conversation ended. Not with resolution, but with a line drawn. I walked away knowing something fundamental had shifted. Back home, the inheritance stopped feeling like a gift and started feeling like a test. The next day, I called Aunt Julia, my father's sister, the only one who had never played along with the family's version of reality. When she told me Grandpa had added a forfeiture clause, anyone who contested the will would lose their share, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Grandpa had seen this coming, and he'd prepared for war. The days after the will reading blurred together into a relentless campaign of pressure. It started subtly missed calls, vague texts about family responsibility, and then escalated into something far more aggressive. Every conversation felt like an intervention I hadn't asked for. My father called daily, his voice heavy with disappointment, as if my refusal were a personal betrayal rather than a boundary. Melissa's messages were longer, dripping with moral language carefully crafted to make me feel small. According to her, I wasn't just refusing to help Chloe, I was dismantling the family. Extended relatives joined in. Cousins I barely spoke to suddenly had opinions. Aunts forwarded articles about generosity and sacrifice. It was exhausting. The narrative was clear and consistent. I had become selfish, cold, ungrateful. No one seemed interested in Grandpa's actual wishes. Fairness only mattered when it benefited the right person. When I felt cornered, I turned back to Aunt Julia. She listened without interrupting, then let out a bitter laugh. I'm not surprised, she said. Your father and Melissa are panicking. They've been living beyond their means for years. That stopped me cold. Julia didn't speak lightly, and when she continued, her tone sharpened. Credit cards, loans, refinanced mortgage, debts stacked on top of debts. That inheritance isn't about Chloe, she said. It's about survival. The truth unfolded quickly after that. With Julia's help, I confirmed everything. The vacations, the new car, the constant financial cushioning for Chloe, it had all been funded by borrowed money. Worse, Melissa had already convinced Chloe to let them manage a large portion of her inheritance. It was gone, spent, used to plug holes they'd dug themselves. I was furious, but more than that, I was afraid for Chloe. Despite everything, she was still my sister. I invited her for coffee, hoping that outside our parents' orbit she might listen. She arrived guarded latte in hand, eyes already narrowed. When I explained what I'd learned, her disbelief turned sharp. That's ridiculous, she laughed. They would never do that. I offered proof. Bank statements. Records. She didn't want them. Instead, she accused me of jealousy, of trying to sabotage her relationship with our parents. When she walked out, I felt like I'd failed her. A few days later, she called, not to apologize, but to accuse. Melissa had gotten to her first. According to Chloe, I was bitter, delusional, obsessed with victimhood. I told her the truth one last time. She hung up laughing. I realized then that truth means nothing to someone who benefits from the lie. The house of cards would fall eventually, but not before it crushed everything beneath it. After that phone call, something in me went quiet. Not calm, resigned. I stopped trying to explain myself, stopped defending my intentions. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing you're fighting ghosts, that the people you're trying to save are actively choosing the fire because it's warm and familiar. Chloe had made her choice. She wasn't just ignoring the truth. She was standing between it and herself with a smile. My parents wasted no time capitalizing on that loyalty. The story they told the family hardened into something almost mythic. I wasn't just greedy anymore, I was vindictive, manipulative, a daughter who had turned on her own blood the moment money entered the picture. Group chats filled with pointed messages about values and what Grandpa would have wanted, as if his will hadn't been written in ink, legally binding and explicit. During this chaos, the one place I felt grounded was with Daniel, my boyfriend. He never tried to fix anything or tell me what I should do. He just listened steady and present, reminding me that boundaries weren't cruelty. Watching him react with quiet disbelief to my family's behavior made me realize how warped my sense of normal had become. The real blow came in the form of a letter, a thick envelope from a law firm, formal and cold. My parents were contesting Grandpa's will, claiming he hadn't been of sound mind when he wrote it. I sat at my kitchen table reading it twice, then a third time, the words blurring. They were willing to risk everything, including their own inheritance, just to regain control. The forfeiture clause no longer mattered to them. Desperation had replaced logic. Melissa didn't even try to hide her entitlement when reporters and relatives asked questions. Outside the courthouse, she framed herself as the wronged matriarch fighting for her youngest child against an ungrateful older daughter. Listening to her rewrite reality so effortlessly made my stomach turn. I called Aunt Julia the moment I could breathe. She wasn't surprised. "They think pressure will break you," she said. "It won't." Still, the idea of months, maybe years of legal warfare made my chest tighten. This wasn't just a fight over money anymore. It was about power, about proving I could no longer be controlled. When Chloe called to brag about signing papers my parents brought her, I didn't argue. I hung up. For the first time, I understood that saving myself meant letting her fall. The lawsuit had begun. There was no turning back. Once the lawsuit began, my life shrank into manila folders, legal jargon, and a calendar filled with dates I couldn't escape. Depositions replaced dinners. Courtrooms replaced living rooms. Every interaction felt adversarial. Every word, something that could be twisted and used against me. My parents' lawyer was polished and sharp, the kind of man who smiled while implying I was calculating enough to manipulate a grieving old man into rewriting his legacy. Sitting across from him while he questioned my motives was surreal. He painted me as ungrateful ambitious in the worst way, a daughter who saw her grandfather not as family, but as opportunity. Hearing my character reduced to something so ugly was almost harder than the betrayal itself. Melissa leaned into the performance with unsettling ease. In court, she cried on cue, spoke about sacrifice, about how much she had given to raise me as her own, conveniently omitting the years of emotional distance and quiet dismissal. My father followed her lead, nodding along, his voice thick with practiced sorrow, as he described me as someone who had changed. According to them, money hadn't revealed who they were, it had revealed who I was. Each hearing felt like watching strangers wear my family's faces, rewriting decades of history without hesitation. What kept me standing was Aunt Julia. She showed up to every proceeding, every deposition, unshakable. When she testified, her voice was steady, almost surgical. She spoke about Grandpa Robert's clarity, his sharp memory, his frustration with entitlement, his insistence that fairness wasn't negotiable. She told the court plainly that he had added the forfeiture clause precisely because he knew someone would try to bend his wishes. He was protecting his legacy, she said, looking directly at my parents, and he knew exactly who he needed to protect it from. The room went silent. The turning point came with the financial records, pages and pages of undeniable proof, credit card statements, loan agreements, transfers from Chloe's inheritance account into accounts controlled by Melissa and my father. The story they'd told so confidently unraveled under fluorescent courtroom lights. There was no justifying it, no reframing it as misunderstanding or necessity. It was exploitation, plain and simple. When the judge delivered the ruling, I felt strangely detached. The will was valid. Grandpa had been of sound mind. The forfeiture clause was enforceable. By contesting the will, my parents had forfeited their entire share. Every dollar they had been counting on was gone. I watched their faces as it sank in shock. First, then rage, then something like fear. I expected to feel triumph. Instead, I felt tired. Justice had been served, but it didn't taste the way I imagined. It tasted like loss. The court case ended, but the noise didn't. Losing the lawsuit didn't make my parents quiet, it made them louder. They told anyone who would listen that I had destroyed the family, that my greed had cost them their home, their security, their dignity. Phone calls from distant relatives became interrogations. Some asked gently, others with open hostility, as if I owed them an explanation for choosing not to be exploited. I stopped answering most of them. Silence, I learned, was the only response that didn't cost me something. Chloe stayed distant at first. She clung to our parents' narrative, even after the ruling insisting they were victims of my ambition. But desperation has a way of clarifying things. With no inheritance left of their own, my parents began leaning on her harder requests for money, emotional pressure disguised as concern. Slowly, the cracks formed. She started calling less defensively, her questions tentative. By the time she admitted they'd drained her accounts, it was already too late to undo the damage. I listened, but I didn't rush to fix it. Some lessons can't be outsourced. Uncle Peter didn't let up. At a family gathering months later, he cornered me, coffee in hand, and told me I should help my parents now that they were struggling. I looked at him and for the first time didn't feel the need to placate. They're struggling because of their choices, I said. If you think they deserve help, you're free to give it. He walked away angry. I felt lighter. The inheritance changed my life in practical ways. I paid off my student loans. I invested in the financial consulting firm I'd dreamed about for years, focusing on helping young professionals avoid the kind of traps my parents fell into. But the real inheritance wasn't the money. It was the clarity. Grandpa hadn't just left me resources. He'd left me permission. Permission to stand firm, to value fairness over approval, to walk away from manipulation without apologizing. My parents moved into a small rental after selling their house. They still blame me. Maybe they always will. I don't correct them anymore. The people who matter know the truth. Healing hasn't been quick or easy, but it's been honest. I didn't just survive this. I learned from it. And in the end, that's what Grandpa gave me, not wealth, but the strength to protect myself.